Hello and good evening, I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. All public transportation services will now be allowed to operate at full capacity under the RMCO. This includes public and express buses, trains and LRTs, taxis and e-hailing services, as well as ferries and flights. However, some SOPs must be observed, so face masks are a must for both drivers and passengers. Drivers will need to sanitize their vehicles. Also, cashless transactions will be encouraged, and both drivers and passengers must input the details into the My Sejahtera app. So, back to full capacity, back to somewhat normal, I would say, Sharaad.
Yeah, absolutely. And Melissa, you know, in fact, doing the story, it reminded me that I had to get onto the My Sejahtera app, and so I did that earlier today. Almost went, you know, without a hitch. It took a bit of time to get that initial number to input in your registration, but it came after a couple of minutes.
Yes, there were some hiccups, some technical hiccups in the beginning, anecdotally by people saying that they were unable to sign up to this app, but so far so good, Sharaad?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I'm on the Selangor Langkah app as well. I mean, these are just ways in which contact tracing can happen with greater ease in the event that you know, somebody is discovered to be positive and was in a public place. So I think we've discussed in this show, Melissa, all the concerns around privacy and data. But putting that aside, these are clearly tools for us. The other thing, of course, Melissa, is I actually use public transport on a daily basis because I don't drive.
So what do you think about this full capacity then? That means that social distancing or safe distancing may not be able to be observed in, you know, trains, for example, or buses.
Well, I think there are trade-offs, you know, and one of them will be that you can impose a social distancing and reduce the capacity of the trains, especially at peak hours where the capacity is more than 100%, as it were. You know, I mean, it's filled to the brim. I mean, if you've been in an LRT or the MRT at rush hour, you know what I mean. The question, of course, is then you double the time in terms of waiting, maybe triple the time of waiting. And the question is, quality of life of individuals will clearly suffer as a consequence. And I think for individuals for whom, you know, the other options, more costly options are not there, this will become an added burden to them. So, yeah, what are the trade-offs? How do you keep yourself safe? And I think taking on personal responsibility for your health, I think, is essential in this game.
I completely agree. You know, I mean, I'm thinking about what this means, right? For public transportation to be allowed to resume at full capacity. I understand that, you know, perhaps the capacity is not, you're not able to limit the capacity of public transportation and observe all the social distancing, the safe distancing, but I'm wondering what the trade-offs will be. I mean, particularly for flights. So we hear flights are now allowed to operate at full capacity. So that means that, you know, will that mean that airfares will not be increased because airlines will not have to compensate for the lack of passengers?
You know, there's a lot of chatter about the current state of airline prices and so on, and you know, ticket prices and such. But I think, putting aside the issue of, you know, options that I think we can explore with our bosses, which is the question of staggered work time, so that you don't have to come in during rush hour. You can come in just after rush hour, or you know, leave a little later, or leave a little earlier. Make it such that if we in fact reorganize the way in which we use public transport, perhaps there won't be such a crush at those, you know, in terms of traditional rush hour times. Surely there are creative ways to respond to the situation, I think, and I don't think it's just the government that needs to be involved in this conversation, clearly individuals as well.
Well, in other news, some Sarawak schools may not be able to resume all classes on the 24th of June as thousands of teachers who returned to their hometowns in the Peninsula of Malaysia have not been able to report back to their respective schools. Michael Mannion, who is the Sarawak Education Minister, he said that this involves some 2,600 teachers in Sarawak, 400 of which are Form 5 and Upper 6 instructors. Now, these teachers were told to report back on the 9th of June to prepare for the reopening of schools, but apparently they're facing difficulty getting back to Sarawak due to the limited flights from the peninsula. Apart from the lack of flights, Michael Mannion also cited the higher fares, which is proving to be a hurdle for many.
Yeah, I sometimes, my heart goes out to people in government trying to work out all the different parts of the problem, right? So many things involved, and perhaps the question of teachers returning to Sarawak, teachers having to deal with cross-border issues. So going back to Sarawak is not simply about arriving in Sarawak, it's also about the possibility of quarantine there for a period, and how that interrupts or disrupts their possible engagement with the school from the get-go. So there are all these things to be considered. I think there are some discrepancies, Melissa. Apparently, if you're a tourist coming into the state, you don't have to be quarantined, but if you're a teacher, you do. The question, of course, is why, and I think some of the rationale has already been explored in terms of the intensity of contact with students and such.
So what we understand is that the Sarawak Disaster Management Committee says that teachers must be quarantined for 14 days on arrival. Those serving in schools in urban areas or in towns may home quarantine, but those in rural areas will be quarantined at designated hotels. And so Sarawak says that they cannot really start classes on June the 24th because some of these schools may not have enough teachers. I'm wondering whether this was a problem that could have been anticipated, and why wasn't it anticipated? Yeah,
these are big questions around. Like I said, the magnitude, Melissa, is of this of the problems in resolving all these logistical issues.
The question also is who foots the bill? If there are higher airfares, who is going to pay for that?
Yeah, it seems that unfair for teachers, especially coming from the peninsula, to take on that additional burden at this point in time. Hopefully, there's some sort of resolution that is, a win-win for everybody.
All right. Speaking about teachers and the reopening of schools, let's find out what the challenges are in implementing the staggered return of students to the classroom. We're going to be speaking to two education experts in just a few minutes. So stay tuned to consider this. Sorry, tak dengar.
Hello. Seng. Hi, Sharaad here. Can you hear me?
Hi, Sharaad.
Hi, Melissa here. Hi, Seng. Thanks so much for doing this.
Would you prefer to be called, should we call you Seng?
Yes, Seng is perfect.
Okie dokie.
Yes, okay.
Looking forward to it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sharaad, you've taught in our school before, in one of our TFM schools.
I have. Yes. I think last year I went to a girls' school in Klang and I was a completely useless teacher because it was, I was completely unprepared. But it was a fast.
Consider this. I'm Melisa Idris, with me, Sharaad Kuttan. Yesterday, the Education Ministry announced the reopening of public schools for exam year students only, starting from the 24th of June. Joining us on the show now to discuss this further is Chan Soon Seng, CEO for Teach for Malaysia, which is an NGO focused on education inequity. Soon Seng, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. I want to begin the conversation by perhaps getting your thoughts on the rationale for this staggered approach to opening schools. The ministry is choosing to have cohorts facing exams return to school first rather than the younger students. So how are you making sense of this approach?
Yeah, hi Melissa and Sharaad. Thanks for having me on the show. I think it's quite indicative of what education has meant for Malaysia for a very long time. And I think that one of the things, and actually the ministry is trying to shift away from this, but one of the things that has been a big focus of education in Malaysia is a focus on the exam orientation, and that sort of our exam results are kind of like the be-all and end-all of education. And I think that there's some practical reasons for that, right? So when we think about where these students are going to go post secondary school, the system is set up to operate based on exam results, right? And so I think the ministry has chosen to focus on ensuring that kids who are sitting for exams this year go back to school first. But I think what we've seen in other examples in other countries in the world is that kids of a younger age actually go back to school first because older age kids are actually more able to self-study or study independently from home, and younger age kids need the in-person support more. And we also see that at the primary level, those are absolutely crucial foundational years that can't be avoided. But in our case, I think the ministry has made this decision because it will have knock-off effects if the SPM and examination upper 6 years don't go back first and aren't able to effectively sit for examination. Well,
there was a comment in the news today by the NUTP, the National Union of Teaching Profession. They're recommending that the earliest for primary school students, primary schools to reopen nationwide should be in late September or October. That's more than 3 months away. Well, what are you thinking about this?
Yeah, so Teach for Malaysia is focused on ensuring that, like you said earlier, that we close the inequity gap. And that's basically the idea that some kids have less access to education than others. And we actually think that physical school is actually a huge equalizer for education in Malaysia. And so during the MCO period, there have been so many children that have not had access to education during this period of time. The ministry's survey estimates about 37% of households don't have devices for students. And in a recent study that came out that studied the effects of the 2005 earthquake in Pakistan, where schools were closed for 14 weeks. So 14 weeks will be the number of weeks that our schools would have been closed, well, not closed, but learning from home once our Form 5 students go back. And in this study, they found that the closure of 14 weeks resulted in a learning gap of 2 to 3 years for the kids that were most affected by the school closures. So we think that it's actually crucial that kids get back to school as soon as possible because there are so many kids that do not have access. Obviously, that needs to take into account public health and safety measures. But I think with the situation in Malaysia, I think as long as we do that in a controlled fashion and we are very effective in the ways that we test, track, and trace, that we can actually get back to school faster than that timeline.
Right. Something, it struck me odd to, when you say, when you came up with the expectation that this is a reversal or a gap of 2-3 years, that this would be the knock-on effect, because I'm thinking of of school systems in other countries where kids go off for say summer break and they take 3 months off and long periods of time. Why is it, explain to a non-expert like myself, why is it that going out of school for 3 months under these extraordinary circumstances would lead to such a devastating impact on learning?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that when we think about things like 2 to 3 month summer holiday, or we think about things like a gap year where a student takes that time off, those are scheduled times off. And those are intentionally there. And so what we're seeing is an additional interruption to the standard learning time. And so when we see what then happens is that if you do that in comparison to a kid that has whose learning isn't interrupted, then you see the disparity. So what we're potentially going to see is that there are students who have not had any access to learning because maybe they don't have connectivity, maybe they don't have a device, but there are some kids who are learning. at this point in time, who are able to connect, who are able to get in touch with their teachers.
Right.
So those students will be progressing at a certain rate, whereas the students who don't have access to learning during the MCO period would be left behind, so to say.
But sometimes, Seng, those two kids are in the same class. How are schools going to help, when the time comes, how will schools ensure students return and help learners who have fallen behind during school closures, especially if they're not quite up to speed with, say, their classmates and their peers?
Yeah, great question. I think that's why it was a great decision by the Ministry of Education to cancel PT3 and UPSR this year. And so I think that when we take away, because these are very high-stake examinations, and the ministry already has existing alternative assessment forms, which can be used to assess the learning of children. And so what that allows teachers to be able to do is to address the specific learning needs of their students. And so a challenge that you typically see in schools is that teachers are rushing to complete the syllabus because they need to complete all of the content in order for students to be able to get tested on all of that content. Now, when the teachers have flexibility to, because the students aren't sitting for those high-stakes examinations, teachers are able to then select the content that is absolutely crucial, the most crucial content, and then use the classroom-based assessment to be able to assess their students' progress on that. So in this case, we can give teachers the flexibility to actually differentiate according to the different needs that their students will have, or the disparities or the gaps that their students will have. Now, one thing that will be absolutely crucial at this point in time, a misconception is that schools are closed. They're not closed. Schools are in operation, and teachers are meant to be teaching their students during this time, right? Students are just supposed to be learning from home. So even with the return of the Form 5 and the Upper 6 students, the guidelines that the Ministry of Education put out has actually guidelines about provisions for students who aren't coming back to school yet. So it talks about continuing home-based learning, whether that's through online methods or through other methods, such as sending materials to students. There are even suggestions about how schools can have drop boxes where kids can pick up work and send work back for teachers to be able to give them feedback on it. And so it's going to be absolutely critical for schools at this point in time to also ensure that they're not ignoring the kids that aren't coming back to school yet. And we should consider education in full swing even for those who aren't. And actually, with the reopening of school, that should allow more logistical ability for schools to get materials into students' hands.
Right. So I wonder if this moment, the last 3 months, has been an opportunity for conversations that weren't happening before, based on some of the structural problems in our education system. We know that kids go to school for 12 years, but the actual learning is much less than that, and that's obviously a defect in the delivery of education. Are you hearing conversations about reform within the education system that could happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And so referencing what I said earlier about the cancellation of UPSR and PT3 for this year, that is a potential silver lining of what we could see happen for education. And even when we look into the Ministry of Education's guidelines, there is a shift away. So for those that grew up in the Malaysian education system, the traditional experience is that there's a lot of chalk and talk, which is a teacher standing at the front of the classroom. They're telling you information, you're writing down notes, and you're supposed to memorize the quote-unquote right answers. And the Ministry of Education for the longest time has tried to shift away to a more student-centered learning approach where they're focusing on 21st century skills like collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, and communication. And what the challenge has been is that because we are so focused on examinations, that distracts a teacher from being able to pursue different methods of learning delivery. And so actually with the shift away, at least this year, from UPSR and PT3, that will give teachers an opportunity to actually experiment more with with different ways of learning, if they're not just trying to rush and teach kids how to sit for an examination. So in the ministry's guidelines, you'll see things like project-based learning comes as a recommendation for teachers to be exploring during this point in time. And that's a great way to shift learning so that it's something that is a lot more relevant to the time and just a lot more engaging for students as well. And so I think that there is an opportunity here to reimagine what learning could look like in our schools.
Sure.
And
that's very encouraging to hear, Seng. Thank you so much for speaking with us. We really appreciate your time and for you sharing those insights with us tonight. We're going to discuss.
It was a pleasure.
We're going to discuss more on the plan to reopen schools in just a few minutes. So stay tuned to consider this. Gana, hello.
Hi, Gana. Can you hear us?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I apologize in advance.
We're running
time
out
is
of
a bit
time,
limited,
time
but
is
we'll
of
try and
the
get as much
essence.
as we can out of this conversation.
Sure.
Hopefully, we'll bring you back on another show at another time. But yeah, today we have about 6 minutes.
6 minutes, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. Let's continue our conversation about the plan to reopen schools on a staggered basis from the 24th of June, starting with Form 5 and Upper 6 students first. Joining us on the line, Ganakumaran Subramaniam, Head of the School of Education at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Gana, good evening. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now, I'm going to begin with a three-pronged question. Just how damaging has the closures of school been for students? Which group of students have been the most affected? And can the quote-unquote damage be reversed in the coming months?
Okay, thank you for having me on the show. How damaging the situation has been, I think the situation has been quite damaging globally, not just in Malaysia. Because everybody was caught unawares in terms of how expensive this situation is going to be. And I think largely we were unprepared, teachers, students, and the whole, sort of community was unprepared for what we were about to face. Who were most affected? I think, again, the answer, if I look at schools, and this is based on, I don't think there's any statistics out there yet, but based on my discussions with some school principals and headmasters, roughly 20 to 25% of students in most schools, perhaps not in the urban schools, but in a lot of schools would have suffered from a lack of connection with their learning. Can the damage be, repaired in the future? It is going to be a challenge. Students have lost a lot of learning time, and I think what we need to do is we need to think about, okay, so going forward, how do we look at repairing the damage to the best of our ability? Maybe we need to look at our curriculum, which is bloated at this point of time, and say, okay, all right, so let's remove some of the bloat from the curriculum. Let's focus on the core important subjects that are, relevant for students to progress, and take them through that at the moment. And I think we need to make these very difficult and critical decisions, going forward.
Gana, I want to ask you if you could help us focus on the teachers who are there to deliver the curriculum. There are probably huge expectations for them to pivot towards online learning. And now, as you say, perhaps in thinking about or reimagining education and the curriculum to trim the fat, focus on the core. Are teachers prepared to do that? I mean, will they be happy, in fact, to go along with these new ideas about delivering the curriculum?
Okay, I mean, to be fair to teachers, they were taken by surprise as well. In many schools, teachers and the school setup was not ready for moving on to online education. Well, the ministry did its part. It provided some training for teachers, to begin to teach online. And I think most of the teachers were game triers. They tried their best to use whatever means possible. Though the ministry recommended, e-learning platforms and Google Classroom and Google Meet and so on, but teachers went on to use whatever they could, WhatsApp even. But I think the critical point here is that are teachers ready? Do they have the skills and competence to teach online, and now to look at revisioning the curriculum and delivering it in another way. Okay. And because of this staggered idea of returning to school, I think one of the critical points we miss out. We talk about teachers being trained and teachers being ready. We forget that learner readiness should also be there. Whether learners know how to use the digital tools to access the learning that they're supposed to access.
Sorry to interrupt you, Gana, about touching on the idea of being ready, right? I'm just wondering why, given all the, we've heard that there's been difficulties with learning from home, distance learning. Why, in your opinion, has almost every other economic, social, and religious activity have been allowed to resume almost completely, but not schools, at least not fully? Why is that? To me, well, I think the challenge is that our environment, our school environments are quite packed, quite compact. The infrastructure currently is something that does not allow perhaps social distancing, the kind of healthcare issues that need to be taken care of. These are problems in the current school setup because our classrooms are 40, 45, 50 in a lot of situations. So how do we manage this in that context? How do we ensure that the children are safe? How do you ensure the teachers are safe in this kind of environment? I think this is what's holding back the ministry while they plan and look at a way of slowly bringing things back in. Okay, so it's the infrastructure and the facilities that's perhaps limiting, that's requiring for a staggered approach, returning to children to classrooms. Well, Gana, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. We really appreciate your time. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have for you tonight on Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.